This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know that feeling when you're reading current philosophy or maybe just watching the news, and it feels like the big ideas are just stuck on repeat? It's like philosophy has settled into this relentless cycle of criticizing science, pointing out its limitations, but it just seems to lack a clear, powerful purpose of its own. It feels, well, tired.
That observation is, it's fundamentally correct, and it speaks to a really profound structural shift that's happened over the last few centuries.
Okay.
We're diving into why philosophy is having this moment of fatigue. Your sources suggest that for most of its history, philosophy wasn't just about thinking deep thoughts. It was a highly effective and frankly necessary defense mechanism.
A firewall, basically.
Exactly. Our mission today is to understand precisely what it was defending, and critically, what happened when that thing it was defending just sort of evaporated. We'll map the historical mission of philosophy, which was deeply dependent on theology, and show how that foundation disappearing led us straight to this state we're calling guarding an empty castle.
And then the 3 working modes it adopted.
Yep. We'll cap it off with the 3 distinct global working modes philosophy adopted in response to that whole collapse.
Okay, let's get into that, because its idea of philosophy as a defense mechanism is really compelling. If we looked at the historical giants, Augustine, Aquinas, Kant, even Hegel, what was philosophy's primary non-negotiable job?
Its primary role, the original job description, it was never meant to be autonomous. It was specifically to critique and limit reason and empirical science, all in order to protect theology.
To protect theology.
It was an auxiliary service, like a highly skilled legal team working for the overarching system of faith.
Wait, I need to pause on that, because when we talk about Augustine or Aquinas, theology wasn't just another subject. It was the entire societal operating system, wasn't it?
It was the bedrock, absolutely. Think of it this way. In those eras, theology, and I mean the church, religious authority, the whole metaphysical order, that was the central governing structure. It dictated everything from law to cosmology.
Okay.
So as reason and logic and natural science began to rise, they posed a genuine, an existential threat to that entire system.
And if that system fails, society fails. So philosophy had to step in.
Precisely. Philosophy acted as the mediator, the rampart. It was a kind of intellectual wall, a defense mechanism that held the line.
So it defined the borders.
Its core function was to define the boundaries of what pure reason or science could know. It basically said, yes, you can use logic to understand the natural world, but those boundaries stop here before you undermine the revealed truth of the church.
It was giving theology intellectual credibility.
In the face of rising empiricism, yes, it had a high-stakes public purpose, which explains its historical prestige.
Okay, but the sources point to a complete structural breakdown that, it changed that job description forever. What failed?
2 things happened, more or less at the same time. First, the protected object theology. It weakened dramatically.
How so?
It stopped being a strong, centralized public system. It was no longer the required metaphysical operating system for the state. It receded into what we now just call private personal faith.
It's no longer public policy for the universe.
Exactly. And at the same time, the threat science, it just grew exponentially.
So the character of the threat changed.
Fundamentally, science evolved from a set of, challenging intellectual theories into social infrastructure. It builds our hospitals, it runs our economy, it manages our medicine. It's woven into the fabric of modern life.
You just can't critique science the same way when turning it off means society stops running.
The stakes are completely different.
Absolutely, and that's the crucial detail. No one today, structurally speaking, is seriously advocating for the public. National defense of theology as a system, the target for protection. It's just absent from the public square.
The thing it was meant to lift up isn't there anymore. It isn't. So when philosophy tries to do its job, the heavy public object it was designed to lift, it's just gone.
And this is where it gets really interesting and honestly a bit tragic. If the thing philosophy was structurally designed to protect is gone, what is left for it to do with all its defensive machinery?
Well, the structural result is almost inevitable. Only the activity of criticism of reason and science remains.
So the motion continues, but the purpose is gone.
Right. The historical function of drawing a limit is preserved, but the object behind that limit is missing. So philosophy gets stuck in this endless loop of doubt and critique, perpetually pointing out the limits of reason or what science can't explain.
It's the activity of drawing the line without knowing what you're defending on the other side. I love that analogy from the sources. Modern philosophy is structurally the soldier continually attacking the enemy science after losing the castle they were meant to defend.
And that's what creates that feeling of fatigue you mentioned at the start. The purpose of asserting the limit is now unclear. The critiques can feel, vestigial. And the whole exercise looks like perpetual defense without a clear offensive goal. It's an intellectual habit without a home.
Let's talk about the major intervention here. Postmodernism. When that wave hit, did it try to rebuild the castle? Or did it, try to save the old religious authority?
Neither, actually. Postmodernism didn't really engage in the old fight of saying theology is true or false. Instead, it just dramatically removed its footing entirely.
What do you mean by that?
Well, earlier critical philosophers, even someone like Nietzsche, they still treated metaphysics and theology as profound, real concepts worth debating. Postmodernism changed the whole dynamic. It started questioning the conditions under which these concepts were even created.
So how do they do that?
It was characterized by doubting grand narratives, metaphysics, historical purpose, objective meaning. It dissolved the idea of transcendent grounds. They argued that concepts like meaning and truth and even the self, they weren't inherent or revealed. They were just effects of discourse, power, or structure.
So the move wasn't, is God real? The move was, how did powerful people in the structure invent the idea of God to enforce their authority?
Exactly. It treated theology not as a belief system to be refuted, but as a kind of artifact of power to be analyzed. And the result was decisive. Postmodern philosophy didn't defeat theology, it just removed it from the stage as a serious public dialogue partner.
It became an object for cultural dissection.
And retreated completely into the private sphere. The irony then is just profound. Philosophy, which was structurally born to elevate theology, ended up dismantling the very context that gave itself relevance.
By aggressively dismantling that theological foundation, postmodernism eliminated its own primary structural function.
That's the key synthesis. It led to these endless self-referential loops of deconstruction, critique, and relativization. And that leaves us in this unstable state today. We have theological critique without theology, and reason limitation without a defensive object.
The soldiers fighting ghosts.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so before that total collapse and the postmodern turn, was there a figure or a moment where philosophers tried to save the deep theological questions like, existence or death, even if they couldn't save the system of God or the church?
Yes, absolutely. The sources identify Martin Heidegger as the last boundary manager between the scientific and the, let's call it, theological domains.
A boundary manager. What exactly does that mean in this context?
He was managing the intellectual borders. Heidegger saw that science was excellent at defining things, what they are, how they function, but he argued that science had absolutely nothing meaningful to say about fundamental human concerns, questions of being, meaning, time, and death.
So he didn't try to rebuild the old church structure?
No, not at all. But he sought to reclaim those existential questions philosophically.
He kept the questions profound and serious, insisting they couldn't just be reduced to psychology or brain chemistry or data points. That was his break on science's overreach.
Precisely. He affirmed that these were irreducible philosophical questions that science was simply incompetent to address. It was his attempt to save the sacred domain that theology once governed.
And what was the great divide that moved philosophy from saving those questions to just tearing them apart?
It was a shift in focus. Up until Heidegger, the philosophical effort was basically, can we philosophically salvage these crucial existential questions? After him, the postmodern turn shifted the focus entirely from why do people ask theological questions to how is that question constructed? By power, by language, by social structure.
So it stopped being the mediator seeking truth, and it became the forensic specialist examining the linguistic and social construction of the questions themselves.
That's the core of the transition. The function of guarding the line vanished. It was replaced by the function of analyzing the blueprints of the former line. Which is why today, philosophy often feels like a highly specialized language game, detached from the grander life or death stakes it once had.
This brings us perfectly to the global philosophical response to this collapse. Yeah. We have this fantastic framework that looks at the history of philosophy post-theology, not by their ideas, but by their practical working mode.
Right.
Let's look at this geographic tripartite map.
This is a rough, but I think incredibly useful map for understanding the current landscape. It shows how different cultural traditions tried to fill that theological void.
Okay, where do we start?
First, we look at Germany, epitomized by idealism, which culminates in Hegel. Their working mode was construction. After the collapse of the old theological order, their impulse was to build a new overall system, a monumental structure. Kant tried to define the limits of reason. Hegel tried to unify all of existence, history, mind, nature, into one single, massive, interlocking philosophical castle.
Building the castle. I can picture the sheer intellectual effort there. But the sources note this system is now considered too heavy. Why is that?
Because systems of that scale, they inevitably try to explain everything. They're totalizing. They demand complete intellectual surrender to their logic. They became too dense, too self-dependent, and ultimately just too difficult to verify or apply in the rapidly fragmenting modern world.
So too much interlocking machinery.
They built a magnificent, all-encompassing system, but it was just too burdensome to maintain in modernity.
Got it. So next we move to France, the home of postmodernism and thinkers like Foucault and Derrida. Their working mode was the exact opposite: deconstruction and dismantling.
Yes. They inherited a culture that was deeply suspicious of monolithic structures, especially post-revolution. So they looked at the huge German castle and all other foundations, and instead of rebuilding or maintaining, they decided to expose the weak points.
They focused on breaking down foundations, centers, hierarchies.
And linguistic structures, exactly.
They looked at that heavy German castle and said, we don't trust the foundation and we don't trust the architect. The analogy here is smashing the castle.
Precisely. And they were incredibly effective at showing how seemingly stable concepts are actually built on unstable ground, language, and power dynamics. But the inevitable result of smashing the central structure, as we talked about, is emptiness.
Right.
They didn't replace the castle, they just made sure nothing could stand there, which explains that feeling of philosophical relativism that followed.
Finally, we have the Anglo-American tradition, the UK and US, covering empiricism, pragmatism, and analysis. What was their practical response?
Their working mode is practical utility. They adopted a fundamentally different attitude. They just set aside the useless questions, the grand metaphysical debates that the Germans tried to construct and the French tried to smash.
So what did they focus on?
Their focus became very narrow: solving problems, clarifying language, and making philosophy functionally compatible with science, technology, and political institutions.
They weren't interested in defending the castle or smashing it. They just wanted to make something immediately useful out of the ruins. The analogy, using the castle stones to build a bridge.
That's the most accurate description, yeah. This approach allowed philosophy to survive by becoming a kind of auxiliary tool for logic and analysis and avoiding the messy, undefinable questions.
And this is the standard today.
The sources note that this utility-focused mode is the de facto standard today, especially within universities. It's focused on technical clarity. The German systems are too heavy, the French systems are too empty, the pragmatic approach just works.
So, to synthesize this entire journey, philosophy's original high-stakes purpose was totally dependent on a strong public theology that needed intellectual protection. When that theology collapsed into just a private belief, philosophy was left running its defense protocols, the criticism of reason, but without a vital target. The soldiers still fighting, but the defensive war was over.
That recap brings us right back to your core insight from the beginning. Philosophy's continuous critique of science isn't a failure of will, it's the direct structural consequence of losing its protective target.
The function was preserved, but the object was lost.
The function of the boundary manager, yes.
And this structural history forces us to confront the central, unavoidable question for philosophy in the 21st century. If philosophy isn't meant to resurrect theology, or just exist as a high-level academic critique, what is it supposed to be a tool for in the future?
That is the pivotal moment. If philosophy is to reclaim its necessity, it has to find a new, positive object to defend or to serve.
It has to define a new mission.
It does. The sources suggest potential new roles, maybe like acting as a thinking tool consultant or taking on knowledge infrastructure design for society. But this requires defining new boundaries.
We have to choose the new defense target.
Precisely. We must collectively decide what is the new object, whether it's a specific domain of human experience, a scientific auxiliary, a social design meta-tool, that philosophy must restrict science and reason in defense of.
That's the ultimate choice.
It is. If philosophy cannot define that new object, it risks forever remaining merely the echo of an old defense mechanism.
A challenge for all of us to consider. What boundary are we willing to fight for? Something to mull over until our next deep dive.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.